Buried here behind me in this beautiful valley in eastern Tennessee is John Tollett, who was 72 years old when he was brutally tortured and murdered by Union bushwackers on May 1st, 1863. This event would shake Bledsoe County to its very core and would plant the seeds for the Tollet-Swafford feud, which erupted into violence again decades later. Many of the Tollets and their children's children settled right here in the Sequatchie Valley, which stretches 60 miles north to south, dividing Walden's Ridge from the Cumberland Mountains. By the time of the Civil War, most of the eastern part of this state was actually very pro-Union. However, the Tollets understood power and influence and sided with the Confederates. However, a lot of the poorer families, specifically in this case, or the case of his murder, the Swafford family, sided with the Union not because they were ideologically pro-US, but because they wanted to settle old scores. Now, the Swaffords believed that John Tollett had a large amount of gold hidden around his farm. So one day, in May of 1863, 4 men, led by a Swafford, raided his cabin and told him he'd better have the money ready the next time they showed up. John Jr. did go dig up the gold and supposedly brought it to the home of his son, Elijah Gore Tollett. Then he went back to his cabin, barricaded with a man known only as Old Man Monday, and eventually was besieged. The Union bushwackers and Aaron Swafford broke into the house, took the 2 men up to the hill, the ridge overlooking the valley, tied them to trees, and throughout the night stabbed them many, many times, shooting them in the arms and legs. First, Old Man Monday was killed in front of John Jr., and then John Jr. succumbed to his injuries because he was 72 years old. At the time of his murder, John Tollett Jr. lived alone in his cabin because his wife Nancy had died many years before in 1842, and the idea of murdering a man with no wife living only with his friend, Old Man Monday, it was too much for most of this state to even bear. And by the way, when you're in the Tollett Cemetery, just behind John Jr. and his wife Nancy are some fine examples of Appalachian-style tent graves, very common to the early pioneers who settled in these mountains. The Tollett clan used their power and influence to spread the word far and wide that Aaron Swafford was responsible for these brutal murders, and he was very well known in the community as a rabble-rouser. In fact, he committed another murder 2 years later, again unrelated to the war effort, by murdering Hillis McVeigh Dunn because he was sleeping with the man's wife. Eventually, Dunn caught him in the act and threatened to kill him, so he came back and murdered Dunn right in front of his own young daughter, shooting him through the window. Now, just 100 feet down Tollett Cemetery Road, I met a local man who said that he was descended in some way from the Tollets and Swaffords, and the house behind me was built, he believes, by a Swafford, but he's not entirely sure. I asked if he was okay with me filming it from the fence line, and he said I could hop the fence and take a look inside. The same farmer who allowed me into his property, by the way, he said, I asked him if he knew anything about the Tollet-Swafford feud. He says people used to talk about it, but he doesn't know to find the details, but he did say that Miller White, or White Miller, actually was executed. And I asked him what for, because I saw his grave. He was executed in 1939. He said he blew up a house with some other guys, and a few children were inside. Just sad, so many lives lost. Cut short. Almost certainly involved in the Tollet-Swafford feud. Really unfortunate I can't find out a little more info on who specifically owned this. But if it were built by the Swaffords, it would make sense, because it wasn't a feud right down family lines like the Hatfields and McCoys. Some of the Tollets sided with the Swaffords, and some of the Swaffords sided with the Tollets. Look at those beautiful old wallpaper styles. There's the old property line. Nice old shack. And there are so many beautiful old homes like this in Appalachia. Too many to count. As was the case with many Appalachian family feuds, the elders of both the Tollett and Swafford clan did their best to let bygones be bygones. However, the younger generation was fighting more for the honor of their family name. I'm thinking here specifically about WL Tollett, who was born 3 years after losing his grandfather. All he knew was the honor of his family name. And again, to parallel other family feuds, marriage between these two clans often inflamed tensions, and this was the marriage of Martha Tollett to Isaac Easterly Swafford. And what so inflamed WL Tollet is that Martha was his sister, and she was marrying a direct descendant of the man that killed his grandfather. And before this feud was over, the whole town, essentially, would blame Old Ease and his 3 children for the death of WL Tollet. And I hope it isn't lost on the viewers that Martha Swafford actually kept her last name using the double-barreled name Martha Tollet-Swafford, because back in the day, a surname truly did mean something. WL Tollet began to stew over the incident after he lost a second sibling to the Swafford clan. His brother, Major Tollett, not actually a major, married Amanda Swafford, and she's actually buried right here next to his father, Elijah. Now, what's so fascinating about this is that Amanda Swafford was actually the daughter of the man who killed W.L. Tollet's grandpa. This infuriated him, and to allow a Swafford girl to be buried in the Tollett cemetery was too much for him. Although it was probably unrelated to the Tollet-Swafford feud, I should point out that Major Tollett and his wife Amanda had a son named White Miller Tollett. This man was legally executed by electric chair in 1939. Now the children of both intermarried clans were wrapped up in murder cases, leading many locals to assume that bad blood would result from marriage between the two families. Behind me is a remote road on Walden's Ridge, which is where W.L. Tollet finally confronted Aaron Swafford and his son. Up until this point in the feud, it seems to be that both families were trying to smooth things over, but W.L. Tollet was getting more and more furious that his brothers and sisters were marrying the sons and daughters of the man who killed his grandpa. Meanwhile, the Swafford clan was very concerned that W.L. Tollet despised their patriarch, Aaron Swafford, with every fiber of his being. W.L. Tollet came up over the road, not realizing that elderly Aaron Swafford was waiting in the bushes with his son, Jim. Jim jumped out and pulled W.L. Tollet off his horse and began beating him with a cane. Meanwhile, his father, Aaron, began to join in. W.L. jumped back up on his horse and beat a path back to town, with the elderly man laughing behind him. By the election of 1892, both sides had armed themselves, and about 100 of either faction showed up at the polling place. Meanwhile, W.L. Tollet sees Aaron Swafford, locks eyes with him, and before Aaron can even reach for a gun, according to the Swafford witnesses, Tollett pulls his and shoots him dead. That's when his son, Jim, moved forward, supposedly trying to end the whole conflict, and he was likewise shot. Then W.L. Tollet turned around and shot the sheriff, Bill Swafford, Aaron Swafford's son, and hightailed it for the hills. Now the feud had truly begun. In a shocking turn of events, W.L. Tollet was acquitted of the crimes at trial because he was able to prove Aaron Swafford was instigating and that Jim was reaching for a club to beat him. Meanwhile, the shooting of the sheriff, Bill Swafford, he said, was done because he knew that he would be shot otherwise. Because he was found not guilty of the murder, he continued walking around town fairly openly. Around this time, it must have seemed to many folks in eastern Tennessee that W.L. Tollet was a man marked for death. After all, in previous feuds, many people stood a 50-50 chance if they fled to a place like Texas or Alaska, and there was William Lee Tollet walking openly in the streets. Now, it should be remembered that W.L.'s sister, Martha, married into the Swafford clan, but her husband, a man named Old Ease, actually sided with the Tollets. He openly said, yeah, Aaron Swafford killed the man's grandfather, and kept talking smack to him around town. It should have been known what would happen. So there was some inter-family switching of sides, and at least for the moment, W.L. Tollet knew that although he wouldn't flee, he did shoot the sheriff. He figured he probably wouldn't get a totally fair shake, so he kept his head low, but you could still see him occasionally out in the open. Regardless of some of the more nitty-gritty details surrounding Martha Tollet's marriage to old E. Swafford, it seems like Martha's brother, W.L. Tollet, still loved his sister and actually took pretty kindly to her new husband. What's more, he had a good relationship with their 3 young sons, but this all went on the rocks around 1903 when the Tollet father, Elijah, passed away. Now, Elijah was the son of John Jr. Tollet, who was killed by Swafford bushwackers, so the feud lived in his heart, and it was in his dying wishes that he only gave Martha and her new husband a peppercorn clause. He gave the rest of his daughters his entire property and all of his money, but it seems like he only left them a pittance. So the Swafford family actually went over to WL Tollet and said, "You knew your father better than anybody else. Could you go to court and say that he wasn't in the right frame of mind so we could get what we deserve?" And for a while, WL Tollet actually seemed to agree with this, but for some reason, when it came time to actually show up to court, he didn't. And they got nothing, or they got very, very little, and this inflamed tension specifically between the 3 Swafford sons and WL Tollet. By now, some of W.L. Tollet's brothers were openly sympathizing and siding with the Swaffords. After all, the Swafford patriarch had been killed, and regardless of whether or not he deserved it, he also lost a son. And there was W.L. Tollet being, at least what they would say, very petty over the whole ordeal. At the time the feud was reignited, W.L. Tollet's sister, Martha, was beginning to have many children to the Swafford clan, and 3 of these children W.L. Tollet really did love. Again, I should say he actually liked Martha's husband, Old Ease, and the 3 kids he basically raised in his own cabin were Sam, Ease, and Charlie Swafford. Now, these 3 kids were welcome there any time, and he really did have a positive relationship, but they seemed to view W.L. Tollet as a man with a lot of money just lying around the house. So one of them, probably Charlie, snatched some money, made him put the money back, and it wasn't a big deal, but it did sort of reignite something between the 2 families, a little bit of bitterness that might have actually led to W.L. Tollet refusing to show up to court and actually help them gain their inheritance from his father Elijah. By the way, another Swafford child to Martha Tollet and old E. Swafford was Robert Swafford. A young man, he was too young to actually fight in the feud, and he died in 1932, only 38 years old, of tuberculosis. And the only grave I can find in this cemetery of the 3 fighting Swafford kids is Sam Swafford, who is buried right next to his mother Martha and his father Old Ease. So as you can imagine, the 3 children of Martha and Old E. Swafford felt like their uncle W.L. Tollet had cheated their family out of an inheritance they rightfully deserved. And then, one morning at the Pikeville Bank, a man walks in claiming to be W.L. Tollet's brother George, the man buried here behind me, and has a check forged. It has W.L. Tollet's fake signature on it, and he claims this is a check from W.L. to me, his brother. Well, the teller seems very suspicious, but eventually gives the guy the money and calls up both George and W.L., and neither of them are in agreement. They say, "I didn't sign that. I wasn't expecting a check." So immediately, they pick Charlie Swafford, the boy most looking like George and the boy most likely to do it because he probably snatched up that money from his uncle not too long before, and they put a warrant out on him. And because W.L. Tollet is an early riser, he's in the posse, he's the first one out on the streets, he spots Charlie Swafford just walking around, he makes an arrest, and according to Charlie, beats the brakes off him, waiting for the law to arrive. Now, the boys are going around town after this incident because Charlie Swafford is immediately bailed out, openly bragging about their plans to kill W.L. Tollet. They even tell the police. This chapter of the Tollet-Swafford feud officially ends on July 8th, 1905, in the way most people of this county thought it would, with the murder of WL Tollet. Now, this was done by somebody crouching in the bushes while he was moving goods to town when they shot him with a shotgun. Police arrived at the scene of the murder and found footprints going away from the bushes up the road into the home of Golly Swafford. Golly was looked at by the police, and he was a Swafford, but they figured he had no skin in the game, so they quickly arrested all three of the Swafford boys on circumstantial evidence. Pretty soon they found that one of the footprints had a hole in the bottom, and that matched one of the Swafford kids, but this wasn't enough evidence to actually convict them of the murder, and they were let go in 1906. Now, because Aaron Swafford, the man who killed W.L. Tollet's grandpa, was dead, and W.L. Tollet, the main feudist of the Tollet family, he had also been murdered. After these events, the feud gradually began to die down. And this is a farm on Tollet Cemetery Road, probably in the old Tollet family. And this old tree overlooking the Tollet Cemetery, just imagine what it's seen. The burial of W.L. Tollet in 1905 and of John Jr. Tollet in 1863, tortured to death and buried next to his wife. And it looks like the two Davenport brothers here died young as well. I haven't found any reports in the newspapers, but John died in the Civil War, or right after it, and Abe Davenport died as a young man in 1878. They're buried right in the shadows of John Tollet and his wife. And here's some more fascinating variations on the tent-style graves. This looks very similar to a coffin. I believe these are common also in Wales and Scotland. Their main purpose was so that if animals grazed through the cemetery, it wouldn't topple the headstones. I'm on a very slight time crunch, so I don't really have time to go see this cemetery. It's on private property and I don't see anybody out here walking around I could speak to, but according to someone online, this is the cemetery where Aaron Swafford is buried.